Am I? Yeah. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank the organizers for having enabled us, or enabled particularly Indians to cross over. And the importance of our presence here is because Asma herself was so committed to, in fact, cross-border dialogues, of challenging, in fact, the walls, of pulling down those walls that divide us, particularly people to people. The topic that's been assigned to me is looking at communalism in the school curriculum of Pakistan and India. I will, however, focus on India mostly. But before I do so, I want to just lay out, in fact, the benchmark of my concern, which is the critical importance of education for the state and the control of education for the state. And to be able to illustrate this, I want to take you to a small, just tell a small story. A couple of weeks ago, in this southern state of Karnataka, which has become today the outpost in the south of the Hindu right political parties, you had the hijab controversy. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with the Iranian one, but perhaps not so much of this one. It had to do in a small town called Udupi, where women, Muslim women, young Muslim girls who were going to the government women's college, insisted on wearing the hijab to go in, and they were stopped. They were stopped from attending school, college. They were stopped from taking exams. 6 of these young girls went to challenged it in the High Court. Now, the government's discourse in fact, supporting the ban on the hijab was that in the interest of uniformity, in the interest of erasing difference, in the interest of homogenization. Now, this was challenged at the level of the High Court, and in the High Court, the ban was upheld. It went to the Supreme Court. And it's in the Supreme Court that we got a split judgment. But that split judgment says a great deal about their understanding, and therefore, in a sense, the state's understanding of the meaning of education and the role of education, and the importance of policing education, the nature of education. And here I quote to you Justice Gupta, who in fact supported the ban. He says, discipline is one of the attributes which students learn in schools. They should grow up in an atmosphere of brotherhood, fraternity, and not in the environment of rebellion or defiance. The split judgment, as I said, there was then Justice Dhulaiya. And here there was a complete difference in terms of how much the role of policing, or the relevance of policing in education. And here he says, this is the time when students should learn not to be alarmed by our diversity, but to rejoice and celebrate it. Now, all that the petitioners want to do is wear a hijab. Is it too much to ask in a democracy? Now, clearly, his vision of education is one which would foster critical thinking, and that of Justice Gupta, which would be reinforcing homogenization and uniformity. The defense is actually, at one level, pretty solid, meaning, look, caste differences, ethnic differences, what that means, whose identity would be favored, and which other identities would be elided or completely erased. I came across, as I was browsing, a Pakistan Federal Minister of Education saying much the same thing as, in fact, our Justice Gupta. Pakistan's Federal Minister of Education said, and I quote, "If in a country people view reality differently, it creates tension. So if you flatten all identities in Pakistan, that will stop creating tension. it's the kind of language, the kind of argument that you might hear in authoritarian regimes. You don't expect it in a democracy, but then what kind of democracies are both India and Pakistan? I just wanted to frame it in this way and to then plunge in. You know, as I was browsing, as I said, education is not my expertise. Communalism, however, is. I was looking at these trajectories which actually diverged, because the role of education in creating national integration, in fact defining national identity, in socializing cultural, in terms of cultural values, I think is a very well-known thing, and the other speakers may or perhaps elaborate on this. But what was important is the Nehruvian vision was that, look, we are a huge population which is not yet a nation, which is barely a state. How do we in fact create a composite national consciousness, a composite national identity? He rooted it in a phrase that is always associated with him: unity in diversity. And there was a celebration of, in fact, the diversity, but also very much a consciousness of building a modern state, of fostering scientific temper, rational arguments. The history rewriting project was central to this. And it was to actually remove which was the legacy of partition, which was to, in fact, redefine identities away from the religious prism, to take it out of the religious prison, to redefine them. And it's evident in fact, the way that the historical journey of the subcontinent was envisaged. So you no longer had, the British, and it was a legacy of the British, they divided it into ancient India, Mughal India, and modern India or British India. So this was completely moved away from ancient India, which was always seen as a golden age, but the Mughal India was removed, and it was put or recoined or recast as medieval India. And medieval India, in which there was a celebration of the synergies of culture, of, in fact, the contribution of the Mughals, the historical grievances that we today has become the dominant narrative was not the dominant narrative, on the contrary, coexistence, and therefore and then of course there was the British period or the modern period. But if you look at the two historical figures that became symbols of what was Indian history, there was Ashoka and the whole valorization of Ashoka, and there was, of course, the valorization of Akbar. Akbar as both in terms of the eclectic mix of his generals, of his revenue minister, and of course of his own personal life and the support for Deen-e-Ilahi. But now you find the big challenge comes. In 1977, you had a coalition government for the first time, and while the coalition government was led by progressive center-left, you had education being seized by the smaller partner, which then was the Jansangh, the earlier avatar of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party today. And the Jansangh claimed the education ministry, and already you started the challenge to rewriting history or to removing history altogether, and the whole challenge of questioning the kind of interpretation of important historical events. And as I said, the focus was on history. That government didn't last very long, but it was the beginning of, in fact, what were India and Pakistan's divergent strategies or trajectories in terms of educational curriculum, of their convergence. As I said, that regime didn't last long, and you had a pushback and a re-establishment of the existing, and the existing history books have been written by some of that time, were written by some of the most illustrious of our historians, but yes, they were Marxists. Most of them were Marxists. Then you get the return of the Bharatiya, or rather the return of the Hindu right. The Bharatiya Janata Party takes over 1998 to then 2004. It is in this period that you get the biggest pushback. You get the whole issue of, why do we need history? What is its relevance? So history, like in Pakistan, it gets shed. A couple of chapters get incorporated into social studies, into civic studies. Then you get, of course, this huge project of rewriting history. Now, when you have this project of rewriting history and this whole delegitimization of these Marxist historians, you suddenly find that the historians that were associated with the RSS, that is the cultural foundational, ideological foundation of the Hindu right, the RSS, they had been, in fact, hugely propagating the school, a parallel education system, the Saraswati Shishu Mandirs, the Bharatiya, the Vidya Mandirs for secondary and higher education. And so if you look at their text, if you look at the historians who had been writing their books, textbooks, you find that they're the ones who get incorporated. Now here, what is happening here? Ashoka suddenly is not valorized. He's seen as a coward. Akbar disappears. Aurangzeb has that pedestal in terms of what is the Mughal period. And it's suddenly seen as, in fact, a very antagonistic relationship. Elided completely is the fact that, yes, he destroyed temples, but he also built temples. He also gave farmans, he gave land titles to, in fact, to Hindu Brahmins. So it was a much more complex history, but instead you're getting it in terms of antagonistic communities who cannot live together. And you also get the Indus Valley civilization is no longer called Indus Valley, it's called Sindhu civilization. Now what this is doing is, what is in fact a common link, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the terracotta culture, which Ananya Jahanara Kabir writes brilliantly about in Partition and Amnesias, that disappears. It's now getting localized into something that is not in Pakistan, that is not in Bangladesh, only localized to India as Sindhu civilization. And it becomes identified entirely with the Vedic and with the Aryan civilization. The Dravidian aspect of footprint gets elided altogether. I understand in Pakistan, Indus civilization is also not something that is written a great deal about. Then you get, but then you get the return of the Congress-led government, so you have a pushback again. It's the contestations that are important, and important to remember that they are too continuing. It's not fait accompli. But during this period of 2000, which is really the watershed period, you had educationists, you had all kinds of people, including our Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, writing, he's saying, what are you doing by valorizing the Hindu period as the only golden age? Fine. And also, in fact, putting on the same pedestal of achievements in astronomy, achievements in mathematics, with Vedic mathematics, with astrology, you are actually taking away from the real contributions. You are also eliding the fact that we have very rich traditions of skepticism. Romila Thappar's work on the tradition of dissent. It's a book that I would encourage any of you who are interested. So it was a much more complex debate that was taking place, but there was a debate. You get the pushback from the Congress, but by 2014, the Modi government takes over. And here, now you have a decisive shift. what they do is they don't actually attack the federal government is not so active on education. It's a concurrent subject, so it's the states that actually start incorporating, particularly the BJP ruled states, they start incorporating, and all this distortions and biases and this collapsing of myth and history, which was evident in the Shishu Saraswati Prakashan, Saraswati publication schools, becomes incorporated in this. In these state textbooks. As I said, Ashoka suddenly becomes a coward. The Mughal period actually either gets dropped altogether or gets reduced to one small chapter on Aurangzeb. And the whole idea of projecting a very antagonistic, totally irreconcilable relationship. Muslims are cast as predators on Hindu land, on Hindu cows, and Hindu women. There is all that synergy of art, culture, of literature, all gone. So in fact, you get really a poverty of culture. Because I know I have to close. Yes, even the Qutb Minar, which one knows was in fact built by Qutbuddin Aibak, suddenly becomes Vishnu's thumb. Vishnu pole, and built by Samudragupta, one of the, as part of the golden age of the Guptas. You get then this whole, because education is also about defining national identity, defining who and what is a citizen. Who is a citizen? It becomes Hindu Rashtra and those who were born of the faith that in fact was born in the Indian territory. So Christianity, so Islam, out. What happens to all the Muslims? What happens to all the Christians? They get cast as foreigners, as aliens. At best, as second-class citizens, worse, as in fact enemy. And with India and Pakistan, and I don't think I need to elaborate, it ricochets. The antagonistic relationship between India and Pakistan ricochets onto the minorities. And so it becomes in fact almost self-fulfilling. I remember a phrase Bhutto used to use, 100 years of war between India and Pakistan. Well, we're in our 75th year, but I think I would probably say maybe 200 years. I hope not. But as I said, the important thing to remember here, and I don't want to go into, because there are enough speakers on Pakistan, what I want to emphasize is that there are contestations taking place, not only in India, but India and Pakistan civil society groups. I was, just browsing, as I said, I came across the History Project, young people, 3 young Pakistanis who had attended some Seeds for Peace process in the US and came back inspired, and they started this History Project. And they looked at, because in Pakistan, as I found, I was trying to look at parallels, and I said, oh, civilization begins with Mir Qasim and Ghazni. There is nothing before that, and the whole geopolitical moorings of Pakistan, it's like, shifting the state out of the subcontinent and mooring it with West Asia. But when I was looking at comparison, I found, okay, there's Kashmir, and in Kashmir in India we have the narrative of Hari Singh wanting to be independent, the ruler of Kashmir, of the Riyasat of Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, wanting to be independent, but the Pakistani armed forces backing the intruders, tribal intruders came, and Hari Singh panicked and signed the instrument of accession. In Pakistan, as I discovered, there is a different narrative. And in that narrative, Hari Singh started a brutal campaign to drive out Muslims from Kashmir. Over 200,000 people in the princely state supported tribesmen of the Northwest Frontier Province and was successful in liberating Kashmir from the Maharaja's control. We don't even know about the massacre of the Muslims. We, meaning in India, studying in Indian schools, don't know about the massacre of Muslims in Kashmir. But we certainly know about the intruders. In Pakistani textbooks, you would not know that within Kashmir, particularly the valley, there was no support for the Razakars who came. So, I mean, it's more complex history, but we simplified. Similar in partition, I know I don't have the time to do this, but it's also that. So this history project between Indians and Pakistani school children aiming at 12 to 14 or something like that, it worked for a few years from 2016 to something, but as the Modi regime and your new regimes in Pakistan have been much, much more rigid and strict about crossing borders. And finally, I will close here just to say there's also the Khoj project, which some of you may know her, Tista Setalvad, one of our finest human rights defenders and perhaps on the list of the most persecuted by the government of India. She and her partner Javed Anand started this project, the Khoj project for school children. There is also the International Youth Christian initiative between Indians and Pakistanis, I presume with Christian students, all focusing on the 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds. Now, the reason that I want to close on this is I want to emphasize the contestations both at the level of mainstream political parties as well as at the level of civil society and particularly students. And I will close there because otherwise it is a very despairing narrative, but there is contestation.